if you also find that the word God is problematic because it automatically brings to mind a kind of God that is just limited or unrealistic, raise your hand. Yeah. Many more people. Okay. I get it. It's really interesting because people of faith will usually acknowledge that in theory, God is transcendent or beyond us. Even the Bible represents God as taking on innumerable forms and being really unpredictable. But we people have this tendency to keep trying to domesticate God by assigning a gender and claiming to know what God wants and likes or doesn't like, and even trying to get God to help us win at our favorite sports. And a lot of people do that. A recent poll published in Christian Century magazine showed that 48% of Americans think God rewards athletes for their faith. I sense that fewer of you would raise your hand as part of that group. There are lots of ways to interpret that statement, though, so we got to give them the benefit of the doubt there. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, the people of Israel are instructed not to create any images of God because those might become idols that distract people from the real thing. And when Moses asks God's name, he gets the most frustrating answer in the history of answers. God says something to the effect of, "My name is Being." And when these stories were told aloud in ancient communities, back before anyone ever thought of taking them literally, our ancestors knew it was wise to keep God a little bit vague or uncontainable. And here's an interesting fact. As you read them, the Hebrew scriptures start out by speaking of God in the plural, as in we gods. In Genesis, in the story of creation, God says, "Let us create these things." Later, God is singular, but there are still other gods around. That's reflected in the commandment to not worship other gods and the comment that God is jealous. And finally, by the time you get to the Christian scriptures, there is a monotheistic theology. Only one God exists. And this monotheism was considered by many other ancient peoples to be dangerously limiting, and it was even considered to be a form of idolatry. Early Christians, and early Muslims too, were called atheists by their pagan neighbors for having an overly limited, seemingly blasphemous idea of God as a single entity. Later, when religious intolerance was tearing Europe apart in the 1600s, the philosopher John Locke remembered the ancient wisdom. He was a monotheist, but he said that overly limited ideas of God were at the root of the religious violence. He suggested we should think of our ideas of God as one piece of the truth. And he said that only when all of the ideas are put together do we begin to get a glimpse of the true God's infinite nature. That sounds a little bit like Unitarian Universalism, where we affirm that no one religion has the monopoly on the truth, and that all religious traditions contain pieces of it. We're grounded in the ancient tradition of trying to stay humble. Now, here's the thing. In ancient days, religion was mostly ritual. Ritual washing, ritual sacrifices, ritual eating, ritual festivals. You could do a lot of religion without doing very much talking. It was experiential, something you experienced or acted out. But in the 1700s and 1800s, there was a cultural revolution in the Western world, the Enlightenment, in which the dominant mode of being became a lot more mental and intellectual. I think, therefore I am. We started reasoning things out. We developed the scientific method. Myth was poo-pooed. And we started speaking less in myth and metaphor and more in terms of facts and truth claims. Theologians, clergy, and philosophers and scientists who didn't want to lose their religion bought into the notion that reason and scientific truth were superior to myth and tradition. And so it followed that religious knowledge became theoretical instead of practical or experiential. Ritual lost its front and center place in human life. And the religious historian Karen Armstrong writes that we began to understand concepts such as faith, revelation, myth, mystery, and dogma in a way that would have been very surprising to our ancestors. In particular, she points out that people were now expected to accept a set of truth claims or beliefs if they wanted to be part of a certain church. It's no longer enough to just practice. The result was the development of two things that are emblematic of this moment in history: fundamentalism and a specific kind of secular atheism. Fundamentalists set out to prove that their faith is rational and scientific. Did anybody see the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham a couple of weeks ago? Yeah, a few of you. That was a perfect example, actually, of fundamentalism. Ham is the president and the CEO of the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, and he's an activist for getting creationism into the science textbooks in our public schools. And Bill Nye, of course, is the science guy, right? You know who he is. For nearly 3 hours, Ham tried to argue that the Bible's two stories of creation in Genesis, despite their internal contradictions and despite the fact that they suggest the earth is only 6,000 years old, are fully supported by modern science and that nothing can be proven to contradict them. Not geological layers with fossils spread out, not air bubbles from deep ice samples in the Arctic, not carbon dating. Nothing could contradict the story of creation in Genesis, according to Ham. Afterward, Ham received a flood of criticism from Christians who do not take the scriptures so literally. He seemed surprised by this, and he told the Christian Post, "You would think these Christians would be thankful that I presented the gospel during the debate. I guess they wish he wouldn't." This kind of thinking, this belief that in order to be legitimate, religious scriptures must be literally true, is where we get the idea that God is some kind of an old, powerful guy in the sky. Are there stories of miracles? Well, then they must have truly happened. What other meaning could there be? The imagination is constrained. Is Jesus called Son of God? Well, then his mother needs to have been a virgin so we can prove it is literally true. Is humankind made in God's image? Well, then God must have a body. And presumably, when we see him, we'll know what color his hair and skin are, whether he has any tattoos, and what kind of a dresser he is. Is he more like the Pope or more like Richard Simmons? We will see. Or do we think he's in the buff? Well, you get where I'm going with this. At some point, either the logic breaks down or the logical consequences of our thinking become completely undignified. This kind of literalism and its obvious flaws is what prompted people in the 20th century to predict that religion was going extinct. In reality, religion went through a resurgence, and it's still going strong. It was also literalism that spawned a certain kind of modern secular atheism, in which all concepts of God, and the ideas of churches too, are rejected and are even accused of being harmful. We see this perspective in the popular works of Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. Dawkins argues that the religious impulse is an evolutionary mistake. He likens it to a virus or a parasite in the human mind. Sam Harris says that religion poisons everything. The irony is that this sort of atheism, which is now called New Atheism, is itself a kind of fundamentalism. Armstrong writes that, like religious fundamentalists, this class of new atheists believe that they are alone in possession of truth. Like Christian fundamentalists, they too read the scripture in an entirely literal manner. In fact, one time, Marilyn Sewell, who had recently retired from being the senior minister at First Unitarian Church in Portland, Oregon, she interviewed Christopher Hitchens for an article in the magazine Portland Monthly. And when Sewell described herself as a liberal Christian who does not take the scriptures literally, Hitchens replied, "If you do not believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Christ and Messiah and that he rose again from the dead and by his sacrifice our sins are forgiven, then you are not in any meaningful sense a Christian." So there he limited Christianity to the literalist definition. I have a lot of respect for Christopher Hitchens, actually. He had an amazing mind. And I don't blame people who took up his cause and critiqued churches. Churches need critiquing. but it's important to be clear what you're talking about. Hitchens kept saying that Sewell's religion wasn't religion, and I couldn't help but think as I reread this week that it was very similar to the way Ken Ham argued that Bill Nye's science wasn't real science. These two men, Ham and Hitchens, they set off in opposite directions, but their fundamentalism links them back together in practice. But here's what was more interesting. In the same interview, Hitchens spoke of the soul. He talked about what feeds the soul. He used the word soul to speak metaphorically of the part of a human being that is not made up of parts. And he acknowledged that we humans all have a deep, innate longing for the transcendent, the numinous, or the ecstatic that comes out of love, music, and poetry. Those are his words. And he said he would not trust a person who did not respond to those things. He said that he's not artistic, but that he had the gift of writing and speech, and that sometimes he would utter a sentence or word that he did not know he had in him until that moment. And when this happened, he said, he had the feeling that it was not all done by hand. And when he said these things, he was speaking in words that would not be out of place in one of our worship services. In Aren't the Psalms, we heard the choir sing this morning a form of poetry. And wasn't it precisely the same longing for the transcendent, the numinous, and the ecstatic that led one of those psalmists to write, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God." And deep calls to deep. In the roar of your waterfalls, all your waves and breakers have swept over me. Remember, these are from an era in human history when God remained nameless and formless. The problems begin when we try to think of God as a being of some kind. We can't help ourselves. Our brains just think that way. The theologian Paul Tillich wrote that God does not exist, but is being itself. He said, God cannot be an object of your thoughts because God is no object. For centuries, other theologians have also tried to remind us that God is not a thing, is no thing, nothing. And therefore, as the Presbyterian minister Frederick Buechner puts it, it would probably be most true to say God does not exist at all, except he adds, we would probably take that too literally as well. Tillich called God the ground of being, but he warned that this too was problematic because it makes God sounds so stable. Again, almost like an object, when in reality, being is a process that is constantly unfolding. This isn't just a Christian idea, by the way. The Buddhist monk Brad Warner speaks in similar terms. He wrote a book called There Is No God and He Is Always With You. Isn't that just like the Buddhists? He writes, there's something powerful and indescribable that is the ultimate ground of all being and non-being, and it created you. And some people use the word God to talk about that indescribable something. He says that sometimes he does too. He shares that the Chinese word for this thing is inmo, which means it or that. Inmo is not translated as God, but inmo is like the definition of God that Tillich and Warner are giving. This is where atheism and theism start to overlap. The ground of being, inmo. What we are and what we see are emanations of that thing, the forms that it gives rise to. Maybe inmo is a word for what physicists are trying to wrap their minds around when they look into atoms and see nothing but vast space and unpredictable energy. What the poet was talking about in this morning's reading when she quoted the Hubble scientist who said, "The universe is not only stranger than we think, it's stranger than we can think." It isn't so far from the words even of the Apostle Paul in the Christian Bible, where it is written, "People should seek the Lord and find him, though he be not far from every one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being." And likewise, the fifth century theologian Pseudo-Dionysius said that the being of all things is the overbeing of God, meaning that God is the ground of reality, revealing itself through us and all things. But I wonder, isn't this formless God kind of impersonal? We recently launched a prison ministry in this church. Every week, a small team of trained volunteers goes into Metropolitan Detention Center. We sit in a circle on a concrete floor in a small room deep inside this massive jail. And we have spiritual conversations with men whose bodies are often covered in the scars of violence and poverty and addiction. These guys tend to speak in very concrete terms about God and about the devil, too. The experience of powerful, negative forces pulling at their lives is very real to them. And it's a good theological exercise to ask ourselves whether our theologies are real enough and deep enough to account for the shadowiest part of human existence. What use is this God when your life falls apart? When you're lost, broken, addicted? These guys aren't looking for theories about the ground of being. They're looking for a God you can lean on, like the one the choir sang about when they sang the 23rd Psalm. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You prepare a table before me. A God that feeds souls, that gives strength and peace in the face of those things that would snuff out the light within us. A powerful, nurturing God does not have to be supernatural. I don't believe in a God that is a separate being or that operates outside the rules of the natural world. Most religious liberals don't. But I wonder, would some of you know what I mean if I told you that I have experienced a guiding and healing force in my life that I can best describe as being outside myself, even though I felt it and heard it whispering from within? Would you know what I mean if I told you that I have sometimes felt alone, but at other times in my life have felt held, carried, or nudged along when I was lost? Or that at other times I have felt something was demanded of my soul, some growth or development that was so difficult. I have spent whole years in the spiritual equivalent of an Ironman triathlon. Those were the years I realized I couldn't run away from the sources of my suffering, but had to pass through them, like walking through fire. And that it was prayers, either cursing, foot-stomping, laments, or prayers of gratitude, or prayers of beseeching that helped me find the strength. And would you know what I mean if I said that at other times I have not felt any such sustaining ground of being, but I have found myself searching for it, because the heart has its own reasons for faith and for longing. In the first reading this morning, John Berryman acknowledged that the God to whom he is praying is unknowable, and that he could not properly love that God any more than a guinea pig can love its human owner. But he went right on praying anyway. Or more precisely, he went right on writing poetry. That soul food that even Christopher Hitchens appreciated. May I until death stand forever at attention, he writes. And then there, in the next reading, was Barbara Cricker's Stream of Consciousness, the God's poem that everyone is writing, which she wrote down as though she were standing at attention for an entire day. And some essence shot through all the everyday activities, all the driving, thinking, and moonbeam watching. And it was illuminated. Whatever that illumination is, whatever the radiant ground of being might best be described as, it is personal. Human beings have recognized it since the invention of hieroglyphs and ceremonies. We've told thousands of years of stories about it, sometimes giving it the face of a man or another creature. Sometimes we've given it many faces as a reminder not to get too concrete. It's been described as the voice of the wind or as fire. It has also been called a biological or neurological impulse, and that is surely also a piece of the truth about the infinite. but it lacks the poetry to convey the shared experience of it, or the way it illuminates not just an MRI scan, but being itself. Whatever it is to you, whether you call it God or not, it's good to be part of a church where we bring many names. May you go out today glowing with the light, standing at attention, fed and blessed. Our closing hymn is number